The diner woke up slowly, the way tired places always did, as if each light flickering on had to convince itself it was worth the effort. The air smelled of burnt coffee and old grease, the kind that never really left no matter how much bleach was poured down the drains at night. Outside, the sky was still gray, morning caught between night and day, and the parking lot sat mostly empty except for a few rusted sedans belonging to staff who'd been there since before sunrise. Inside, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clink of ceramic cups were the only sounds breaking the silence. This was the hour before the rush, when the world felt honest, when people came in not to be seen, but simply because they needed something warm to hold. Maya moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, tying her apron tighter as she poured the first pot of coffee. She had learned to move quietly, to conserve energy the way some people conserve money. Every step mattered. Every motion had a cost. Her shoes were worn thin at the heels, and her shoulders already ached, even though her shift had barely started. She had worked the graveyard shift last night too, trading sleep for overtime because the bills didn't care how tired she was. Rent was due. The power company had left another notice. Her phone, tucked in her pocket, held 3 missed calls she was afraid to check. Still, she smiled automatically when the door chimed, because that was part of the job. You smiled even when your chest felt heavy. The biker came in alone. The door creaked as it opened, letting in a gust of cold air that carried the smell of exhaust and leather. He paused just inside, scanning the room out of habit rather than suspicion, then chose a stool at the counter instead of a booth. He wore a black jacket, patched and faded, the kind that told stories without explaining them. His boots were scuffed, his jeans clean but worn, and his beard carried streaks of gray that suggested years rather than style. He didn't say much when Maya approached, just nodded once and asked for coffee. No cream, no sugar. His voice was low, steady, and carried the kind of calm that came from having seen worse than a slow morning. Maya poured the coffee and slid it toward him, noticing how his hands wrapped around the mug, as if he needed the warmth more than the caffeine. She'd served enough people like him to know not to assume anything. Some bikers were loud, demanding attention the moment they walked in. This one wasn't. He sat quietly, eyes drifting toward the window, lost somewhere far from the diner. Maya took his order for a simple breakfast, scribbled it down, and moved on without pressing conversation. She didn't have the energy for small talk, and he didn't seem to need it. As she worked the grill, flipping eggs and scraping burnt bits from the flat top, she thought about how small moments added up, how people passed each other every day without ever knowing what the other was carrying. She thought about the man at the counter and the heaviness in the way he sat, like someone who hadn't slept much in a long time. It wasn't pity that stirred in her chest. It was recognition. She knew that look. She wore it herself most days. When she brought his plate, he thanked her quietly and began to eat without rushing. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for anything extra. He ate like someone who respected food because he'd gone without it before. Maya refilled his coffee once without being asked, setting the pot down gently. He glanced up, met her eyes briefly, and nodded again. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them all the same, a shared understanding that life had not been gentle to either of them. When it came time to pay, Maya rang up the bill and set the receipt beside his plate. He reached for his wallet, fingers brushing worn leather, and paused when she shook her head slightly. "It's okay," she said, keeping her voice low, almost casual. "I've got it." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. "You don't have to do that," he said. Maya shrugged, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." She slid the receipt back behind the counter before he could argue. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't dramatic. It was a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, paid for by a woman who could barely afford to be generous, but something inside her insisted on it anyway. Maybe it was defiance against a world that took more than it gave. Maybe it was simply kindness refusing to die under pressure. The biker studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, respect settling into his expression. "Thank you," he said, and this time the words carried weight. He finished his meal, stood, and left a few bills on the counter anyway, more than enough for a tip. Maya noticed but didn't say anything. He pulled his jacket tighter, paused at the door as if considering something, then stepped out into the cold morning. The door chimed softly behind him, and just like that, he was gone. Maya wiped down the counter and moved on to the next task, the moment already slipping into the background of her day. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done. She didn't expect anything to come of it. To her, it was just one small decision in a long list of sacrifices that no one ever noticed. She had no way of knowing that the man whose coffee she'd paid for carried a loyalty that ran deep and wide, or that kindness, when it reached the right person, had a way of echoing far beyond the moment it was given. Maya's life existed in the spaces between shifts, measured not in milestones but in hours worked and bills delayed. She lived in a small apartment above a closed-down laundromat, the kind of place where the pipes rattled at night and the heat worked only when it felt like it. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through them, a constant murmur that reminded her she was never truly alone, even when she felt isolated. The furniture inside her apartment didn't match, collected over time from thrift stores and curbside finds, each piece carrying a history that wasn't hers. She slept on a mattress that sagged in the middle, waking up some mornings with her back stiff and her thoughts already racing toward the day ahead. She had not imagined her life turning out this way, but she wasn't bitter about it either. There had been dreams once, of college classes she'd started but never finished, of a degree she'd planned to use to build something more stable. Those plans had been interrupted by reality in the form of a sick parent, unexpected expenses, and the slow realization that time was a luxury she couldn't afford. When her mother's health declined, Maya had stepped in without hesitation, juggling shifts at the diner with hospital visits and medication schedules. She had learned early how to be dependable, even when it meant setting her own ambitions aside. By the time things stabilized, years had passed, and the path she'd planned no longer felt reachable in the same way. The diner became her anchor, not because she loved it, but because it offered predictability in a life that rarely provided it. She knew the rhythm of the place by heart, the way the rush built mid-morning, the lull that came before lunch, the chaos of weekends when the grill never cooled. She knew which customers tipped well and which ones never would. She learned to read moods quickly, to sense when someone wanted conversation and when they wanted silence. It was a survival skill as much as a professional one. Smiling came easily to her now, practiced until it felt natural, even on days when her chest felt heavy with worry. Money was a constant calculation. She kept a notebook in her bag where she tracked expenses, down to the dollar, crossing off bills as she paid them, rearranging numbers when something unexpected came up. There was rarely room for error. A missed shift meant a late payment. A sick day meant choosing which bill could wait. She didn't complain about it out loud, but the pressure lived in her shoulders, in the way she clenched her jaw when she thought no one was watching. She had learned to be resourceful, to stretch meals and mend clothes and find joy in small things that didn't cost anything. Kindness for Maya had never been about abundance. It was about intention. She understood what it felt like to need something simple and not be able to ask for it. A warm meal, a quiet moment, a gesture that said someone saw you. Paying for the biker's coffee hadn't been impulsive in the way people assumed generosity to be. It had been deliberate. She had looked at him and recognized a familiar weight, the kind that settled on people who carried more than they let on. In that moment, the cost of the coffee felt insignificant compared to the cost of ignoring that recognition. She didn't talk about these choices with anyone. Acts of kindness were private things to her, not stories meant to be shared or praised. She had grown up watching people give loudly and expect gratitude in return, and it had left a sour taste. Maya gave quietly, hoping that if nothing else, the world might feel a little less sharp for someone else, even briefly. She didn't believe kindness guaranteed reward. If anything, experience had taught her the opposite, but she believed it mattered anyway. Back at the diner, as the day wore on and customers came and went, the memory of the biker faded into the background of her shift. She moved plates, wiped counters, refilled mugs, her mind half on autopilot. The coffee she'd paid for was already absorbed into the day's losses and gains, indistinguishable from dozens of other small expenses. She absorbed without acknowledgement. She didn't regret it, but she didn't dwell on it either. Dwelling took energy she didn't have. When her shift finally ended, she stepped outside into the afternoon light, blinking as her eyes adjusted. The day felt heavy but manageable, the way most of her days did. She walked to the bus stop, apron folded under her arm, thinking about what she needed to pick up from the grocery store and whether she could afford fresh produce this week. The world moved around her, indifferent and relentless. Maya moved with it, carrying her life quietly, unaware that the small kindness she had offered that morning was already being remembered by someone who did not forget such things easily. The biker did not forget the diner or the woman behind the counter once the coffee was gone and the road stretched out in front of him. Long after the warmth faded from his hands and the engine's vibration settled into muscle memory, the moment stayed with him, turning over quietly in his mind. His name was Cole Mercer, though most people didn't use it anymore. To them, he was a patch on leather, a silhouette on the highway, a figure shaped by assumptions that rarely reached the truth. Cole had lived long enough to understand how easily people filled in blanks with fear or judgment. What unsettled him about that morning wasn't the coffee, it was the intent behind it. Cole had spent most of his adult life moving between worlds that rarely overlapped. To strangers, he was just another biker, someone to keep an eye on or step around. To his brothers and sisters on the road, he was something else entirely. He had earned his place among them, not through bravado, but through consistency. When someone broke down at 2 a.m, Cole showed up. When a brother lost a home to fire or flood, Cole organized rides, fundraisers, labor. Loyalty wasn't a slogan to him. It was a code, enforced not by threats, but by memory. People remembered who stood with them when it mattered. The club he rode with was large, sprawling across states, united less by territory than by shared values. Many of them were veterans, former first responders, men and women who understood structure and sacrifice. Others were mechanics, truck drivers, small business owners, people who found in the club a sense of belonging they hadn't found elsewhere. Cole had seen the way society painted them all with the same brush, flattening complexity into caricature. He'd learned not to argue with those perceptions. Time had taught him that truth revealed itself best through action, not explanation. That morning in the diner had cut through him because it ran counter to what he had come to expect. People usually saw his jacket before they saw him. They braced themselves, adjusted their tone, or avoided him entirely. Maya hadn't done any of that. She had treated him like a person first, not a symbol. Paying for the coffee wasn't charity in his eyes. It was respect. It was the quiet acknowledgement that he existed beyond the stories people told themselves. Cole hadn't needed the coffee. He needed the reminder. As he rode out of town, the highway opening up beneath a pale sky, his thoughts drifted to the club. He thought about the brothers he'd lost, the ones still fighting demons long after the battles had ended. He thought about the way kindness rarely reached people like them without strings attached. That was why the gesture mattered. It wasn't transactional. It wasn't performative. It was a small act offered by someone who had very little to spare. That kind of generosity carried weight. By the time he reached his destination hours later, the decision had already formed, though he hadn't yet given it shape. Cole didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in moments that asked something of you. The diner, the coffee, the tired smile behind the counter. They had asked him to remember who he was and what he stood for. He parked his bike outside the clubhouse as the sun dipped low, the familiar rumble of engines greeting him. Inside, laughter and conversation filled the space. The sound of people who trusted one another. Cole removed his helmet and set it down, nodding to a few faces as he passed. He didn't tell the story right away. He let it sit, allowed the feeling to settle. Some stories needed time before they could be shared properly. But he knew one thing with certainty. What Maya had done would not be forgotten, not by him, and not by the people who understood the value of loyalty better than most. When the time came, he would tell them. And when he did, the response would not be casual. It would be deliberate, thoughtful, and powerful in ways Maya could never have imagined. The morning moved on without ceremony, just as most moments in Maya's life did. After the biker left, the diner filled with its usual mix of regulars and passing faces, each one demanding attention in small, familiar ways. Plates piled up, orders were called out, coffee pots were refilled again and again. Maya stayed in motion, her body working on instinct while her mind drifted between tasks. The act of paying for the biker's coffee slipped quietly into the background, absorbed by the rhythm of the shift. It was not something she replayed or second-guessed. There was no dramatic pause where she wondered if she had done the right thing. It simply became part of the day, one more small choice made in a life full of them. When the lunch rush finally eased, Maya wiped down the counter and leaned against it for a brief moment, letting her legs rest. The diner's radio hummed softly in the background, a familiar noise that blended with the clatter of dishes. A coworker joked about how slow the afternoon was shaping up to be, and Maya smiled politely, though her thoughts were already turning toward the rest of the week. She calculated hours in her head, thinking about how many shifts she could pick up if someone called out, how much she might be able to set aside if nothing unexpected happened. The coffee she had paid for no longer registered as a sacrifice. It was gone, spent, indistinguishable from the countless other small losses she absorbed without complaint. Outside, life continued at its relentless pace. Cars passed, people hurried by, the world indifferent to what had occurred inside the diner. Cole rode on, the road swallowing the sound of his engine as he disappeared from view. To Maya, he was already becoming just another customer, his face blending into a long line of tired men and women she'd served over the years. She did not imagine him thinking about her, did not imagine the story traveling with him as he crossed miles of asphalt. She had learned not to expect ripples from her actions. Expectation only led to disappointment. As the afternoon wore on, the diner's atmosphere settled into a lull that made time stretch. Maya restocked napkins, refilled sugar dispensers, and cleaned the same surfaces she cleaned every day. Her body moved on autopilot, but her mind wandered to familiar worries. The rent notice waiting on her kitchen table, the sound her car had started making last week, the nagging fear that one unexpected expense could undo months of careful planning. In moments like these, kindness felt almost impractical, a luxury she could not afford to indulge too often. Yet she did not regret that morning. Regret was heavier than she could carry. By the time her shift ended, the sky outside had shifted again, light softening toward evening. Maya untied the apron and hung it on its hook, stretching her shoulders as she clocked out. The day had taken its toll, leaving her bones tired and her thoughts scattered. She stepped outside, breathing in the cool air, and headed toward the bus stop with the quiet determination that defined most of her days. There was dinner to plan, errands to run, another shift to prepare for. Life did not pause to acknowledge small acts of kindness. It kept moving, demanding more. For Cole, the moment refused to fade so easily. As miles passed beneath his wheels, the image of the diner replayed in his mind, not with urgency but with insistence. He thought about how easily Maya's gesture could have gone unnoticed, how often kindness disappeared into the void without recognition. That was precisely why it mattered. He had lived long enough to know that gestures offered without expectation were rare and powerful. They carried a different weight than favors traded or debts owed. By the time he reached his destination, the decision had settled deeper, no longer abstract, but forming into intention. Cole understood that some moments were meant to be answered, not immediately, but deliberately. The coffee had been a small thing, but it had cut through years of guarded interactions and reminded him of something fundamental. People like Maya existed everywhere, holding the world together quietly while others passed by. The question was not whether her kindness deserved the response. It was how to respond in a way that honored it fully. As Maya boarded the bus home that evening, she stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The diner, the biker, the coffee, all of it felt distant already, swallowed by the demands of the next day. She had no idea that what she considered a passing moment was already growing roots elsewhere. Life had taught her not to expect miracles. She did not know that one was quietly being planned, not out of obligation, but out of respect, by people who understood the value of remembering. The months that followed were not kind to Maya. They arrived one after another with a steady insistence that wore her down in ways no single crisis ever could. Winter crept in early that year, dragging higher heating bills with it, and the diner's business slowed as fewer people lingered over coffee in the cold. Hours were cut without warning, shifts shortened to save costs, and Maya felt the margin she lived on narrowing further. Each paycheck stretched thinner than the last, forcing her to make choices she hated. Groceries became calculations instead of comforts. Fresh food gave way to whatever was cheapest and filling. She learned to ignore the hunger. That crept in late at night, telling herself it would pass. Her car finally gave out on a rain-soaked evening as she pulled into her apartment's parking lot. The engine sputtered, shuddered, and then went silent, leaving her sitting in the driver's seat with her hands clenched on the steering wheel. She stared straight ahead, exhaustion washing over her in a heavy wave. Towing cost money she didn't have. Repairs cost more. For the first time in a long while, she let herself cry, quiet tears slipping down her cheeks as the rain tapped against the windshield. She wiped her face quickly when a neighbor passed, ashamed of the vulnerability. The next morning, she boarded the bus instead, adding another hour to her commute and another layer of fatigue to her days. At the diner, the strain showed. Maya moved a little slower, her smile taking more effort to summon. Regulars noticed and asked if she was all right, and she assured them she was, because that was easier than explaining. Tips dipped as customers tightened their own budgets, and management posted a notice about potential layoffs if business didn't improve. Maya read it twice, her stomach twisting. The diner was not just a job, it was the fragile structure holding her life together. Losing it would mean starting over with nothing to fall back on. There were moments when she questioned her choices, not just the big ones, but the small ones too. Standing alone in her apartment at night, counting change on the kitchen table, she thought about that morning in the diner and the coffee she had paid for. It wasn't regret exactly, it was doubt creeping in, whispering that kindness was expensive when you were already struggling. She pushed the thought away, uncomfortable with where it led. If she started measuring generosity by its cost, she feared she would stop being herself. Despite everything, she kept going. She picked up extra shifts when coworkers called out. She sold a few personal items online, things she'd once hoped to keep but could no longer justify. She learned to patch problems instead of solving them, trusting that somehow it would be enough. Her world narrowed to essentials: work, home, sleep. The days blurred together, each one demanding more than the last. In that narrowing, the memory of the biker faded almost completely, buried beneath immediate concerns. He became just another face lost to time, another small moment that life had absorbed without consequence. Yet even in the thick of her struggle, Maya did not stop being kind. She still refilled cups without being asked, still listened when someone needed to vent, still paid attention to the quiet details others overlooked. Kindness, she realized, was not something she turned on when life was good. It was how she survived when life wasn't. It gave shape to days that might otherwise collapse under their own weight. What she could not see was the parallel path unfolding elsewhere. While she wrestled with bills and exhaustion, the story of that morning traveled farther than she ever imagined. It moved through conversations and memory, gaining clarity with time rather than fading. The coffee she had paid for had become something else entirely, transformed by distance and reflection into a reminder of who she was and what she represented. And as Maya struggled through those months, believing she was alone in her quiet endurance, plans were forming that would one day return to her everything she had given, multiplied far beyond what she thought possible. Cole finally told the story on a night when the clubhouse was quieter than usual, the kind of night that invited reflection rather than noise. Rain tapped steadily against the roof, muting the sound of engines outside, and the smell of oil and old wood hung in the air. A handful of riders sat around a scarred table, cups of coffee and bottles set aside, conversation drifting between memories and plans. Cole listened for a while before speaking, waiting for the right moment. He didn't raise his voice or ask for attention. He simply began, and the room gradually leaned in. He told them about the diner, without embellishment. The early hour, the tired waitress, the way she moved as if she carried more than her share of weight. He described the coffee, the eggs, the silence that felt heavier than words. When he reached the part where Maya had waved away his wallet and paid for his meal, he paused briefly, letting the details settle. The room grew still. These were men and women who understood sacrifice in practical terms. They knew what it meant to give when it cost you something. Cole didn't frame the gesture as charity. He framed it as respect freely given, without expectation, by someone who had every reason to hold on to. what little she had. Questions came slowly at first. Who was she? Where was the diner? Did she know who he was? Cole shook his head. That was the point, he said. She didn't know anything about him, beyond what she could see, and she chose kindness anyway. That detail landed hardest. The club had spent years navigating a world that judged them by patches and rumors, where assumptions traveled faster than truth. Maya's act cut across that familiar tension. It reminded them of a code they lived by, but rarely saw mirrored from the outside. As the story circulated around the table, something shifted. People shared their own memories of moments like that, small kindnesses offered when they least expected them. A rider talked about a stranger who had paid for gas late one night. Another mentioned a waitress who slipped extra food onto a plate without comment. These weren't dramatic rescues or grand gestures. They were quiet acts that stayed with you because they arrived without strings. Cole listened as the room filled with recognition, the shared understanding that such moments deserved acknowledgement. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking: we should do something. The words hung there, simple and open-ended. Cole nodded. He had known that moment was coming, but he hadn't wanted to force it. The idea needed to belong to all of them. Discussion followed, thoughtful and measured. They talked about impact, about doing it right. No cameras, no spectacle, nothing that would embarrass the woman who had given freely. Whatever they did had to honor the spirit of her gesture, not turn it into a transaction. Plans began to take shape, not hurried but deliberate. Someone pulled out a map marking the diner's location. Others offered resources, connections, time. The numbers grew quickly, not because anyone felt obligated, but because they wanted to be part of it. The club was large, its network sprawling. Word spread organically, moving through calls and messages, rider to rider. Each person heard the same story and reached the same conclusion. This was worth showing up for. They set a date months out, giving themselves time to prepare without tipping their hand. The wait mattered. It ensured the response would be intentional rather than reactive. In the meantime, they gathered quietly, setting aside money, coordinating schedules, planning routes. It became something they worked on together, a shared purpose that cut through the usual noise of daily life. Every contribution, no matter how small, was treated with the same respect Maya had shown Cole. Throughout it all, Cole thought about her often. He wondered how she was doing, whether the diner was still holding on, whether life had eased its grip at all. He hoped, quietly, that things had improved for her, though he suspected they hadn't. People like Maya rarely caught breaks without intervention. That realization strengthened his resolve. This wasn't about repaying a debt. It was about amplifying a value they all claimed to hold. When the plans were finally set, the room felt lighter, charged with anticipation rather than tension. They didn't talk about gratitude or heroism. They talked about showing up the right way. Months earlier, a tired waitress had paid for a biker's coffee without expecting anything in return. Now, a community bound by loyalty and memory was preparing to answer that kindness the only way they knew how. Together, the day it happened began like any other, so ordinary that Maya never would have guessed it was about to change her life. The diner was busy in the familiar, grinding way that left no room for daydreams. Orders piled up, the grill hissed constantly, and the bell above the door chimed again and again as customers shuffled in to escape the heat. Maya moved between tables with practiced speed, balancing plates on one arm, refilling cups with the other. Her mind was focused on getting through the shift, on counting tips later and hoping they'd be enough to cover. the bus pass she needed to renew. There was nothing about the morning that hinted at anything unusual. Then, sometime after noon, she heard it. At first, it was just a low vibration beneath the usual noise of traffic. Something felt more than heard. The windows rattled slightly, glasses trembling on the counter. A few customers looked up, puzzled. Maya paused near the register, listening. The sound grew louder, deeper, layered, until it was unmistakable. Engines. Not one or two, but many, moving together with a purpose that sent a strange tension through the room. The diner fell quiet in stages. Conversations trailed off. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Someone near the window leaned closer to the glass, squinting. "What's going on out there?" a man muttered. Maya felt her stomach tighten as she wiped her hands on her apron and took a step toward the window. Outside, the parking lot was filling in a way she had never seen before. Motorcycles rolled in from every direction, engines rumbling in controlled unison. They lined up. With precision, chrome catching the sunlight, leather jackets and helmets creating a sea of blackened steel. Fear prickled at the back of her neck before she could stop it. She had seen bikers come through before, usually one or two at a time, loud but harmless. This was different. This was hundreds. The sound alone felt overwhelming, vibrating through her chest. Customers shifted in, their seats, some standing to get a better look, others reaching instinctively for their phones. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time it felt ominous. The first biker stepped inside, then another and another. They didn't shout. They didn't crowd the entrance. They moved with an order that was unsettling precisely because it was calm. They filled booths and stools, standing where there was no seating, each one waiting patiently. Maya stood frozen behind the counter for a heartbeat, her mind racing. Had something gone wrong? Was the diner in trouble? She glanced toward the manager, whose face had gone pale as he hurried out from the kitchen, hands raised slightly as if bracing for conflict. But the conflict never came. The bikers greeted each other quietly, nodding, making space without argument. They waited. Outside, more motorcycles continued to arrive, lining the street, stretching farther than Maya could see. The engines gradually fell silent, leaving behind a heavy, charged quiet that settled over the diner. The only sound now was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clatter of a cup someone set down too hard. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, muscle memory guiding her when thought could not. She moved from table to table, offering menus, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. No one was rude, no one demanded attention. If anything, they seemed almost reverent, as if they were guests in a place that mattered. That realization confused her more than fear ever could. Then she saw him. Cole stood near the door, helmet under his arm, eyes searching the room. When they met hers, recognition flashed across his face, followed by something deeper. Gratitude, respect. Maya felt a strange pull in her chest, a memory surfacing through the haze of the moment. The biker from months ago, the coffee. Her breath caught as understanding began to form, slow and disbelieving. Cole stepped forward, careful not to rush her. He waited until she finished setting down a plate before speaking. "We're here for you," he said quietly, his voice steady, despite the size of the room behind him. Maya stared at him, words failing her. Around them, the diner held its breath. The customers watched. The manager hovered, unsure whether to intervene or step back. Before Maya could respond, one of the bikers approached the counter and placed a stack of bills down gently, like an offering rather than a demand. "Put this toward the food," he said. Another followed, then another. Soon the counter was covered in money, each contribution added without fanfare. Maya's hands flew to her mouth as the reality of what was happening crashed over her. This wasn't anger. It wasn't intimidation. It was something else entirely. Cole met her eyes again. "You paid for my coffee when you didn't have to," he said softly. "You treated me like a human being. We didn't forget." The words broke through her shock, and tears blurred her vision. The diner, once a place of routine and exhaustion, had become the center of something overwhelming. Hundreds of bikers stood together, not to take, but to give. Outside, more engines cut off as the last of them arrived. Inside, the money continued to pile up, enough to cover every meal, every tip, every repair the diner would need for months. Maya leaned against the counter, barely able to breathe, her knees weak. The kindness she had offered without expectation had returned to her multiplied beyond anything she could have imagined. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers who felt like something closer to family, her world shifted, forever changed by the power of one small act remembered. The diner transformed in ways Maya could never have anticipated. What had begun as a moment of confusion and fear turned into something almost sacred as the bikers settled into the space, their presence filling every corner without overwhelming it. Orders were placed calmly, patiently, with respect. No one shouted, no one rushed her. Instead, they waited, understanding instinctively that the woman behind the counter was still trying to catch her breath. Cole raised his hand slightly, not to command attention, but to guide it. The room quieted. "Everyone eats," he said simply. "Everyone tips. And whatever this place needs, we take care of." His words weren't loud, but they carried authority, born of unity. Heads nodded throughout the diner. Wallets opened again. Some bikers paid for multiple meals without hesitation. Others quietly slipped envelopes toward the manager, murmuring about repairs they'd noticed, equipment that looked overdue for replacement, bills that shouldn't have to wait anymore. Maya moved as if in a dream, coffee pot shaking slightly in her hand as she refilled cups that seemed to empty the moment she turned away. Her tears came and went, blurring her vision, forcing her to stop and wipe her face more than once. Every time she tried to thank someone, they shook their heads gently. "No," one woman said, placing her hand over Maya's for just a second. "Thank you." The words landed heavier than any tip ever had. The customers who had been in the diner before the bikers arrived sat in stunned silence. Some pulled out money to add to the growing pile, inspired by the generosity unfolding in front of them. Others simply watched, eyes wide, witnessing kindness on a scale they had never imagined. The manager, still pale, moved through the room slowly, his disbelief gradually giving way to awe. He whispered to Maya that the register had never seen numbers like this, that the day alone would keep the diner afloat longer than he'd ever dared hope. Outside, the street had turned into a spectacle of its own. People gathered on the sidewalk, phones raised, recording the endless line of motorcycles and the quiet order with which their riders entered and exited the diner. Yet inside, there was no performance, no speeches, no grand announcements. Just hundreds of people eating, paying, and giving back tenfold to a place that had once offered kindness without condition. Cole stayed close to Maya, not crowding her, but present. When she finally found her voice, it trembled. "I didn't do it for this," she said, gesturing helplessly at the room. He smiled gently. "We know," he replied. "That's why we're here." The simplicity of his answer undid her all over again. As the hours passed, the money on the counter grew into stacks that felt unreal. Repairs were promised, rent was covered, tips overflowed into jars that had never been this full. Maya's co-workers arrived for later shifts and stopped short at the door, stunned by the sight. Word spread fast, not through headlines yet, but through whispers and texts and the shared disbelief of those present. When the last biker finally stood to leave, he paused at the counter and slid one final bill toward Maya, folded neatly. "For the days you didn't think anyone noticed," he said quietly. Maya pressed her lips together, nodding, unable to speak. The engine started again outside, the sound rising and falling like a heartbeat before gradually fading as bikes pulled away in small groups. The diner slowly returned to its familiar shape, but nothing about it felt the same. Maya stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by empty plates and full jars, her hands resting on the counter that had been her lifeline for so long. What had come back to her was not just money, though that alone would change everything. It was validation, proof that kindness was not wasted, even when it felt like it disappeared into nothing. The bikers had paid her back tenfold, not because they owed her, but because they understood the power of remembering. The truth came out slowly, not as a declaration shouted across the room, but as a story passed from table to table, carried by quiet voices and shared understanding. Customers leaned in as bikers explained why they had come, how a single cup of coffee had stayed with one man long after the warmth faded. They spoke of a tired waitress who had seen a stranger and chosen kindness without calculation, and how that choice had cut through years of guarded interactions. Each retelling added clarity, connecting the present moment to that ordinary morning months ago. Maya listened as if hearing the story for the first time. From the outside, it sounded almost unreal. She remembered the moment clearly, the brief exchange at the counter, the way she had waved off his wallet without thinking twice. To her, it had been insignificant, barely worth remembering. Hearing it, reframed through their voices, unsettled her. She saw herself reflected, back in a way she had never allowed before, not as someone struggling to keep up, but as someone capable of altering the course of another person's day in ways that mattered deeply. Ko spoke again, this time not just to Maya, but to the room. He explained how often people like him were met with suspicion or fear, how rare it was to be treated with simple respect. He did not blame anyone, he did not accuse. He spoke calmly, describing a world where small gestures carried disproportionate weight because they were so unexpected. That coffee wasn't about the money, he said. It was about being seen. The words settled over the room, heavy with truth. A man at the counter nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "I never thought about it like that," he murmured. Others echoed the sentiment, faces softening as understanding took hold. The story of the coffee became something larger than a transaction. It became a reminder of how often people passed one another without recognition, how easy it was to overlook quiet acts that held the world together. Maya felt heat rise to her face, a mix of embarrassment and awe. She hadn't intended to make a statement, she had just done what felt right. Yet here were hundreds of people responding to that instinct with a generosity that reshaped her understanding of cause and effect. She realized then that kindness did not disappear when it went unnoticed. It waited. It found its way back in forms you could never predict. As the truth spread, something shifted among the diners and the staff alike. Conversations turned reflective. Strangers shared their own stories of moments when someone had offered help without being asked, when a small kindness had arrived at exactly the right time. The diner became a space not just of food and noise, but of shared humanity, a place where walls lowered and assumptions softened. The manager finally spoke, his voice unsteady as he thanked the bikers for what they had done. He admitted how close the diner had come to shutting its doors, how precarious the last months had been. The room fell quiet again, as the weight of that admission landed. This wasn't just generosity for generosity's sake. It was survival. It was preservation of a place that meant something to its community. Maya stood behind the counter, hands braced against the edge, grounding herself. The truth was no longer just hers or Cole's. It belonged to everyone in the room. The coffee had been a catalyst, but the response revealed something deeper about connection and responsibility. As the last of the story settled into place, Maya felt a profound shift inside her. She was no longer just reacting to the day as it happened. She was witnessing the ripple of her own humanity, returning to her magnified, undeniable, and transformative. Maya tried to keep herself together as the weight of everything finally pressed down on her all at once. She had spent months holding her breath without realizing it, bracing herself for the next bill, the next setback, the next quiet disappointment. Now, standing behind the same counter, where she had counted change and wiped away exhaustion, the dam cracked. Her hands trembled as she stepped back from the register, pressing her fingers to her lips as tears spilled freely, uncontained and unashamed. She turned away for a moment, shoulders shaking, overwhelmed not just by the money or the crowd, but by the sudden release of fear she had been carrying alone for so long. Cole didn't rush her, none of them did. The bikers understood restraint, understood that this moment belonged to her. A few stood quietly, heads bowed, giving her space while still holding the room steady. One of Maya's co-workers moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her back, whispering that it was okay, that she could breathe. Maya nodded, trying to steady herself, inhaling deeply as if relearning how. When she turned back around, her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, but her expression held something new. Relief. Gratitude so deep it bordered on disbelief. "I don't even know what to say," she managed, her voice breaking. The words felt inadequate compared to what she was feeling. She gestured toward the overflowing counter, the full tables, the faces watching her with kindness instead of expectation. This changes everything." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Someone near the door spoke up gently, reminding her that she didn't owe anyone a speech, that this wasn't about words. Maya nodded again, swallowing hard. She realized then that she didn't have to perform gratitude, didn't have to prove she deserved what was happening. These people hadn't come to be thanked. They had come to give, freely, deliberately, the same way she had months ago. Her mind raced ahead despite herself. Rent paid without panic, repairs done without debt, a night of sleep without calculating tomorrow's costs. Possibilities she had trained herself not to imagine now stood suddenly within reach. The realization hit her with another wave of emotion, and she laughed softly through tears, shaking her head in disbelief. "I paid for a cup of coffee," she said, almost to herself. Cole met her gaze, his expression steady and sincere. "You reminded us who we are," he replied. The simplicity of the statement quieted her. She understood then that this moment was not about charity. It was about alignment, about people recognizing themselves in one another and choosing to act on that recognition. Around them, life in the diner continued in a softened way. Plates were cleared, coffee was poured, conversations resumed, quieter now, more thoughtful. The extraordinary had folded itself gently into the ordinary, as if insisting that kindness did not have to be loud to be real. Maya wiped her face with the edge of her apron and took a steadying breath. She felt changed, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in something deeper. The fear that had lived in her chest loosened its grip. In its place was a certainty she hadn't known she needed. She was not invisible. Her choices mattered, even the smallest ones. As she returned to work, moving through the diner with renewed steadiness, Maya carried that knowledge with her. The breakdown had not been a moment of weakness, it had been a release, a necessary step in accepting that sometimes giving did come back, not as a reward, but as a reminder that the world, for all its hardness, was still capable of responding to kindness with overwhelming grace. The ripple effect of that day extended far beyond the diner's walls, moving outward in ways Maya could not have predicted even as she stood in the middle of it all. News traveled fast in a small town, faster still when hundreds of motorcycles had lined the street without incident, without anger, without spectacle. By evening, photos and videos had begun circulating online, accompanied by captions that struggled to capture what people had witnessed. Some focused on the size of the group, others on the money. A few tried to frame it as a curiosity, but those who had been there understood it differently. They spoke about respect, about remembrance, about kindness returning in ways that felt almost unreal. The diner became a point of conversation everywhere. Regulars stopped by the next day, not just for food, but to check on Maya, to tell her they'd heard what happened. Some brought flowers of their own. Others slipped extra bills into the tip jar, inspired by what they'd seen. The manager posted a handwritten thank you note by the register, not naming anyone specifically, but acknowledging the community that had shown up when it mattered most. For the first time in months, the future of the diner felt secure. Repairs were scheduled. Equipment that had limped along for years was replaced. The place breathed easier, and so did everyone who worked there. For Maya, the attention was disorienting. She had spent so long moving through the world unnoticed that being seen, even kindly, felt strange. She answered questions carefully, always redirecting the focus away from herself. It wasn't about me, she told anyone who asked. It was about what happens when people look out for each other. She meant it. The story had never been about a heroic waitress or a grateful biker. It was about connection, about the space between people where empathy either lived or died. The bikers returned to their lives as quietly as they had arrived, but the impact lingered among them too. The story of the diner became a touchstone, retold not as a boast, but as a reminder of their values. It reaffirmed something they had always believed, but rarely articulated, that strength meant responsibility, and loyalty extended beyond their own circle when it was deserved. They had not just paid Maya back, they had paid forward a principle they wanted to see reflected in the world. In the weeks that followed, other diners and small businesses reached out, sharing their own stories of unexpected generosity and support. Maya read messages from strangers who said the story had changed how they treated service workers, how they approached people they didn't know. She didn't know what to do with that kind of influence, and she didn't try to harness it. She simply kept showing up, pouring coffee, offering kindness, the same way she always had. What struck her most was how the moment reshaped her sense of possibility. She allowed herself cautiously to imagine a future that didn't feel like constant survival. She paid off overdue bills and fixed her car. She even enrolled in a night class she'd been putting off for years, testing the waters of a dream she thought she'd lost. These changes didn't come from sudden wealth, but from breathing room, from the knowledge that she wasn't standing alone on shifting ground anymore. The community felt it too. The diner buzzed with a renewed warmth, a sense that something meaningful had passed through and left a trace behind. People lingered longer, talked more openly, treated one another with a touch more patience. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. And difference, Maya realized, was how change began. As the weeks turned into months, the story settled into memory. No longer a headline or viral clip, but a shared reference point. a reminder that kindness, even when it felt small or impractical, could ripple outward in ways that reshape lives. The waitress who paid for a biker's coffee had never expected anything in return. Yet her quiet generosity had sparked something larger than herself, something that would continue to echo long after the engines faded and the diner returned to its familiar hum. The legacy of that single cup of coffee did not live in the money stacked on the counter or the motorcycles that once filled the street. It lived in the shift that followed, quiet but permanent, settling into the way people moved through the world afterward. Maya felt it most clearly in the mornings, when she unlocked the diner before sunrise and stood alone for a moment, listening to the hum of the building waking up. The fear that had once greeted her at that hour was gone. In its place was a steadier confidence, not loud or boastful, but rooted in the knowledge that her choices mattered more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. She continued to work the counter, to pour coffee and smile at strangers, but something inside her had changed. She no longer saw her kindness as a weakness or a luxury she could not afford. She understood now that generosity did not always drain you. Sometimes it returned, multiplied, not just in money, but in reassurance, in community, in proof that the world noticed even when it seemed not to. The act that had once felt insignificant now stood as a marker in her life, a reminder that she was capable of influencing more than her immediate circumstances. For Cole and the riders, the diner remained a symbol long after the event itself faded from public attention. It reminded them why they rode together in the first place, why loyalty and respect mattered beyond their own circle. They spoke of Maya often, not by name, but as an example of the kind of person worth showing up for. Her kindness had affirmed their belief that the values they lived by still existed in the wider world, waiting to be recognized and returned. The diner itself became something of a quiet landmark. New faces came in, some drawn by the story, others simply by the smell of fresh coffee and the warmth of the space. Regulars returned with a renewed sense of belonging, proud of what their small corner of the world had represented. It was no longer just a place to eat. It was a place where people remembered that small acts could carry enormous weight. Maya never asked for recognition, and she never chased the story as it traveled. She allowed it to pass through her life without letting it define her. What defined her was the same thing that always had: resilience, empathy, and the stubborn refusal to let hardship harden her. The bikers had paid her back tenfold, but the true gift was the clarity she gained. She understood now that kindness was not something you offered when life was easy. It was something you chose precisely when life was hard. This story isn't about a waitress or a biker or even a diner. It's about what happens when one person chooses to see another, not as a stereotype, not as a transaction, but as a human being. It's about how that choice can ripple outward, touching hundreds of lives in ways no one could have planned. Somewhere, right now, someone is offering a small kindness they think no one will notice. And somewhere else, someone is remembering it, carrying it with them, waiting for the right moment to return it. If this story moved you, let it remind you of the power you hold in everyday moments. Like this video, if you believe small acts still matter. Share it with someone who needs to hear that kindness is never wasted. And subscribe to this channel for more true stories that prove even the simplest gestures can change lives in ways we never expect.